Hi, I'm Alicia. Welcome to GenTales, where genealogy meets history. This video on the Merchants' Guilds and Livery Guilds of London and the colonization of the New World by those commercial adventures were originally published in 2 parts on GenTales on Substack. I have them linked below. If you're interested in anything else I talk about in those videos, you can find the references and the links to those guilds there. I also did edit out a transition that was used on Substack because it doesn't make sense when it's the full video. But if you want to see it in its original form, you can also find that there. Today I'm discussing some ancestors from my paternal lineage. Instead of focusing on one ancestor or one line, I want to talk about trades my ancestors were involved in, specifically the livery and merchants guilds. This video is actually going to be 2 parts, and that's because the merchants guilds bled into the companies formed to populate and harvest what is now New England. Commerce in general drove the colonization of the New World, and my ancestors appear to have had a hand in it from 1200s all the way up until the 1700s. It's a rather broad conceptualization when looking at the guilds of the Middle Ages to the trade of Tudor and post-Tudor England, and then to the colonization of the new resource-rich areas in the American colonial period. So this part 1 is on the guilds, and part 2, it will be on the companies that stemmed from that framework to colonize the New World. Now, let's dive into the livery companies of London.
There are currently more than 100, but they started as 12 merchants' guilds in the Middle Ages. I have ancestors who are of various ranks in the membership of at least 7 of these ancient guilds. Though the Mercer's Company is thought to have been started by the Mayor of London in the early 13th century, it was granted a royal charter and seal in 1394. These arms were by John Stow in 1633.
At the time of its charter, the Mercer's Company was made up of merchants who sold general goods, managed commerce, or were involved in export-import. Members from my lineage who were members of this guild include the following:
Grain exporter John Sturgeon, Master Henry Frowick, his son Thomas Frowick, Richard Lovelace, his great-nephew Henry Lovelace, and Daniel Gorsuch. The Drapers' Company was formally established in 1361, but even at that time the company dated back at least 200 years. It was incorporated under royal charter in the 15th century and was the first corporate body granted a coat of arms.
At the time, the Drapers were a trade association of wool and cloth merchants. Members of my lineage in this company include
Robert Lewis, Master Sir Thomas Adams, Master Edward Claggett and his sons Edward, Richard, and Thomas, with Thomas being my direct ancestor, and Master John Hall. The Merchant Tailors' Company started as the Guild and Fraternity of St. John the Baptist of Tailors and Linen Armorers prior to 1300 and was granted royal license in 1327.
It was originally an association of tailors and a religious fraternity. My ancestor James Wilford, who died about 1426, was a master of the company. In 1503, it was renamed from tailors to the Merchant Tailors.
The Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths was the original Goldsmiths' Guild. They were given the responsibility of inspecting and hallmarking precious metals in 1327 with the distinctive king's mark, the leopard head. They are one of the few guilds still active in their trade and are still located at Goldsmiths Hall.
In addition to inspecting and marking precious metals, the company founded a school to teach the trade and are responsible for checking the validity of British coinage. Thomas de Frowick, a brother of one of my direct ancestors, was a renowned goldsmith and artisan who is thought to have been an early warden of the Goldsmiths Company. In fact, in 1303, he made the gold crown for King Edward's II Queen Margaret of France. There's speculation that she never paid him either. There's some interesting anecdotes out there.
The Grocers' Company was established in 1426 and was made up of merchants from the Guild of Pepperers, which dates back to 1180.
The Pepperers traded in herbs and spices, and they set the standards for them at the time. In 1617, those who handled medicinal products split off from the grocers as apothecaries.
My ancestor Henry de Frowick was a member of the Guild of Pepperers, but a goldsmith by trade, and William Wettenhall was a master of the Grocers' Company. The Vintners' Company is one of the oldest of the livery companies. It dates back to at least the 12th century in association with the Church of St. Martin in the Vintry and was given a royal charter in 1363.
This guild of merchants imported and sold wine, specifically from Gascony. Over the centuries, though, their licensing and rights have slowly diminished, leaving them as a ceremonial society today. Thomas Cornwallis, who died in 1384, was an alderman of the Vintry. He was buried in St. Martin in the Vintry, but the church was destroyed in the London Fire of 1666.
He may still be under the intersection that now exists there. The Haberdashers' Company has records going back to the 14th century, but was given a royal charter in 1448.
It was originally comprised of merchants involved in the silk and velvet trade. In 1502, they absorbed the hatmakers' fraternity. My ancestor, Sir George Barne, who died in 1593, was master of the company in 1586. Another of my ancestors who was a member of this company was William Garrard. He died in 1571, but was also a member of the Merchant Adventurers and the Muscovy Company that traded with Russia. A prime example of how commerce crossed over into colonization. But today I'm talking about the crossover from the Merchants Guilds to colonization efforts in the New World, what is today New England.
In the 15th century, the Merchant Adventurers Company was a chartered trading company in London. It was made up of cloth merchants who originally focused mostly on wool trade with Scandinavia and then Western Europe. However, it had roots going back to the Fraternity of St. Thomas of Canterbury in the early 13th century.
Men in the Merchant Adventurers Company could inherit their membership from their fathers. It was not something you could do in the guilds. My ancestor William Garrard was a member of both the Merchant Adventurers Company and the Haberdashers Company, and he was also a member of Muscovy Company,
which held the monopoly on trade between England and the Tsardom of Russia, known at the time as Muscovy. It continued until the Revolution in 1917. It was a chartered joint stock company that would create the framework for how to finance the colonization of the New World by England.
Other ancestors involved in this venture was founding member George Barne. He served as chief merchant between England and Russia, and his son George inherited the real estate holdings from Muscovy Company when his father passed. Another company at this time was the East India Company, which probably sounds more familiar. It was chartered around 1600 to do similar trade with what was then called the East Indies. It's Southeast Asia today. This kind of import-export would have originally fallen under the Merchants Company 200 years prior, but the merchant adventurer companies of the post-Tudor period specialized in routes or stock, venturing out beyond the borders of England. France had their own version of this entity.
6 years later, King James I chartered what would later be named the Virginia Company. It was a trading company of men from London that intended to colonize the eastern coast of the so-called New World. They named the area they were colonizing Virginia. Established under the same charter was the Plymouth Company, made up of men from Plymouth, England. Edwin Sandys, brother of my ancestor Anne Sandys Barnes, was a member of both the East India Company and the Virginia Company. Sir William Lovelace the Younger signed on to the Second Virginia Charter in 1609 and invested in the East India Company. His father, Sir William Lovelace, then signed on to the Third Virginia Charter in 1614. Thomas Graves was an original stockholder in the Virginia Company and made supply runs between the colonies and England until 1616, including the second run to Jamestown. He settled in Virginia as part of the Society of Smith's Hundred.
In 1628, Cromwell's Parliament created the New England Company, a Puritan society of missionaries. A little different than the commerce companies, but had the same goal. They ended up founding Salem, Massachusetts.
The investors changed their name to the Massachusetts Bay Company when they set their sights on colonizing Massachusetts Bay, despite the land already belonging to a number of native tribes.
They made the change under the guise of promoting the fur trade between England and the new colonies. However, the charter from Charles I served as a vehicle for spreading Puritanism. The other companies were run from England. The Massachusetts Bay Company was run from what is now Boston, with the goal of colonizing the entirety of New England as a Puritan settlement. The English court revoked the charter in 1684, but the colonists remained. The Puritans were told to return to England, and they said no.
My ancestor, Sir Thomas Adams, who died in 1667, this is his effigy from his resting place in Sproutston. He was a member of the Drapers' Company and a grantee on the Massachusetts Bay Charter in 1629. He served as the London-based director of the Massachusetts Bay Company. He was also a founder and original member of the New England Company.
These weren't the only companies colonizing or trading at the time, and some failed. George Barne had also invested in Willoughby's failed quest for the Northwest Passage in 1553. But these ventures I discussed here were the ones that my ancestors were involved in and were somewhat successful, depending on your perspective, as some of these efforts also resulted in conflict with the native tribes. Unfortunately, my ancestors were involved in these ventures as well. And the next video will be on my ancestor who's known as the Conqueror of the Pequot.